Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Today it's one of those big long chapters. 50 verses, Numbers chapter 16. So there's a lot to get through today, so I'll dive straight in. But by way of introduction, let me just say, over the years in my Christian life, I've been a Christian for over 50 years now. I've attended or visited churches a great many times, and I've sometimes witnessed unrest among sometimes church leadership, even sometimes open rebellion in a congregation against either leadership or the senior pastor. I've also come across many church schisms and splits over the years, and I've often, when seeing these events, pondered what the Lord would say about such situations. Well, interestingly, I believe the Bible provides us with a passage that mirrors this scenario almost identically, offering us insights into God's perspective on schism, on rebellion within the church. So I'm sure there's something here that many of us can learn today as we turn to Numbers chapter 16 to explore this together. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now, before delving into chapter 16 and reading the text, and I'm going to cover it all today, let me give you a bit of background. It's essential to remember what we've seen so far, especially in the narrative of Numbers, since this time when the people left and supposedly began the process of entering the Promised Land. Because what we've seen so far is Moses' leadership being challenged several times. In fact, it happens in chapters 11, 12, and 13 and 14. And now in chapter 16, it's happening again. And this time Aaron, his brother's position, is also coming under threat. Now, the exact timings and location of these events are unclear. All we know is that they occurred during the years spent wandering in the wilderness, following the Israelites' refusal to enter the Promised Land. Well, the opening verses introduces us to three main characters. Let's hear what it has to say. Korah, son of Ishar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dan and Abiram, son of Elab, and On, son of Peleth, became insolent, and they rose up against Moses, and with them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the council. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron, and said to them, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why do you then set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" When Moses heard this, he fell face down. Then he said to Korah and his followers, "In the morning the Lord will show you who belongs to him, and who is holy, and he will have that person come near him. The man he chooses he will cause to come near him. You, Korah, and your followers are to do this. Take censers, and tomorrow put burning coals and incense in them before the Lord. The man the Lord chooses will be the only one who is holy. You Levites have gone too far." Let me just say that a censer was a curved, flattened metal sheet on which coals and incense were burned. Okay, so what we have here is these three key guys, and there are around about 250 people siding with them. And what's critical to note here is that Korah is from the tribe of Levi. Now that's going to be significant. The other two, Dathan and Abiram, are from Reuben, and the rest are made up of these various 250 leaders, community leaders from across the other various tribes. Now, the key thing to understand here is the fact that not all Levites were priests. You've heard me say this before several times. All priests were Levites, but not every single Levite served as a priest. Some worked in the temple or the tabernacle, but were not actually priests as such. Korah in this passage is from the tribe of Levi, but he's not one of those designated a priest. And this distinction is crucial for understanding what's really going on here. Verse 3 tells us they gather against Moses and Aaron and accuse them of holding on to too much power for themselves, saying, "Isn't everyone holy, therefore everyone is equal?" So in this first opening passage, it shows to us that there is, well, a rebellion, a sheer rebellion going on. But look at their complaints. They say, "You've taken too much upon yourself." Well, frankly, that may appear to be a charge against Moses and Aaron, but is actually an accusation against the Lord, because Moses was very clearly designated as the leader of the people by God, and they witnessed those events on Mount Sinai. We've already seen that in the previous chapter that we looked at yesterday, where his leadership was challenged again, well, it didn't end well. In fact, in certain circumstances, it gave several potential outcomes. It would actually even potentially end in death on some occasions. But yet, here again they are, challenging Moses and challenging Aaron as well. Challenging Aaron as the one who is designated the high priest to the Lord. So in doing this, they are really in absolute open rebellion against God. Now, the second thing that they're doing is they're actually accusing Moses and Aaron of doing these things out of personal ambition. They're not only questioning God, but they're questioning the motives of those who follow him, saying, "You're doing this simply to exalt yourselves." But that's not what has happened. God put them in that position. They weren't exalting themselves. They were simply doing what God told them to do. But these guys, they're not happy with us at all. And what they do is they rally other people to agree with them. So we have a sort of building up here of, well, an open rebellious, not a good situation, is it? Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have many times in my Christian life seen this happen in churches, more than once. What you see often is where someone on a leadership team, or sometimes just a member of a congregation, is happy, usually with a senior pastor, and they go around trying to get people on their side in the congregation, and it can cause no ends of problems for that church and the congregation. I'm going to tell you about one case I know about, where a man in the ministry faced really intense criticism. Even his integrity was questioned. And this is the kind of things that they said about this guy. They said he walked according to the flesh. They said he was actually deceitful, untrustworthy, and he imitated, in other words, he plagiarized other people's in the things he wrote and the things he said. They said he mistreated some people, he defamed people. They even said that he made promises that he didn't keep, and that he mishandled discipline in that church situation. They actually even accused this guy of taking money for himself, fleecing the flock under the disguise of collecting money for a ministry outside the church. Now, I'm going to do something now, something I wouldn't normally do. I'm going to name who that person was. And that person who faced all those accusations was the Apostle Paul. These things were all written about Paul. What I've just basically done for you is I've paraphrased all the criticisms recorded of him in 2 Corinthians, where they charged him with all of those things, including even taking up an offering for the poor in Jerusalem and keeping it for himself. So what I'm saying here is nothing is new under the sun. It's the same old, and it's going on today in churches all around us. Now, understanding and explaining Kohath's motive in this passage is the big challenge in it. If we get a handle on why he's done this and what he wanted out of it, then we might really understand it. But how it actually works out in the text is they get this group of people together and they go to Moses and Aaron and they lay out their challenge. So we need to see how Moses responds. The accusations are made, he listens to what they say, and then it says he falls on his face, indicating simply that he prayed profoundly. And then he gets up, speaks to Korah and all the company, that 250 people he's brought with him. So having sought the Lord in prayer, Moses says this: tomorrow morning the Lord will show you who is and who is not for him, and the one whom he chooses he will cause to come near to him. So Moses, having sought the Lord, throws out a challenge, simply saying, come tomorrow and let the Lord decide. Then in verse 6, Moses instructs them to take these censers and bring them with them the following day, and to put coals in them, and to start a fire and put incense on them when they come and gather before the Lord the next day. Now, here's the key, or one of the keys anyway. Putting incense in a censer was a priestly function, which highlights the fact that the real issue here was with Aaron more than Moses. They were essentially saying, why aren't we all priests? We're from the tribe of Levi, just like Aaron. Should not we be priests too? And in verse 7, Moses is seen to address Korah and the sons of Levi, asking the question, the real nub of the matter is, what you are really suggesting is that you're all in the priesthood now. And that, I believe, is the explanation of what's underpinning all what's going on here. Some from among the Levites were indeed assigned to the priesthood, but others were called to serve in the tabernacle, but not to serve as priests. Kohath is essentially complaining because he wants to be a priest as well, but he's not from the priestly line within the tribe of Levi. And Moses here simply reminds him that God has given all of them a special and unique place, and for them it was to serve in the tabernacle, and that they should be content with that. But it seems they're not happy with their assigned place, does it? Ultimately, they are coveting the position of a priest. So while they're appearing just to be accusing Moses and Aaron of sort of usurping and taking authority, Moses is pointing out that it's actually Korah and those non-priestly Levites with him who are rebelling against God by seeking roles they were not appointed to do. Anyway, the text continues, picking up in verse 8 through 15. And it says, Moses said to Korah, now listen, you Levites. Isn't it enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the Israelite community and brought you near himself to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle and stand before the community and minister to them? He has brought you all and your fellow Levites near him, but now you are trying to get the priesthood too. It is against the Lord that you and your followers have banded together. Who is Aaron that you should grumble against him? Then Moses summoned Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, we will not come. Isn't it enough that you have brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey to kill us here in the wilderness? And now you also want to lord it over us. Moreover, you haven't brought us into the land flowing with milk and honey, or given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. Do you want to treat these men like slaves? No, we will not come. Then Moses became angry and said to the Lord, do not accept their offerings. I have not taken as much as a donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them. So Moses is simply pointing out what's really going on here, the fact that Kohath and his followers were going too far in their rebellion because they were actually seeking, the real motivation was a seeking of more power and prestige, exhibited by desiring the role of priests, instead of being content with the assigned tasks behind the scenes that they'd been given them, important tasks to minister to the wider community. And we see here in verse 11, Moses questioned their complaint, particularly focusing in on the unjust complaint against Aaron, essentially asking them, why, in effect, are you challenging the Lord's appointed leaders and the roles they've been put in? Then in verse 13, we see Moses summon Dathan and Abiram to come before him, but they refused to come. Instead, they simply again accuse Moses. Well, this time they accuse him of leading them out of Egypt with his promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, only to let them die in the wilderness. They blame Moses for not bringing them into the promised land, conveniently forgetting that it was their own refusal to enter it when they reached Kadesh Barnea that has got them into this situation. So please make note, the accusations are false, absurd, and baseless. Sadly, this kind of behavior is familiar still today. When we're faced with internal conflict within churches, people often come up with false, baseless, or illogical arguments. They even twist the truth to suit their agenda. It's a classic case of what's called projection, accusing others of having the very faults that you possess. It's astonishing to witness it when it's played out in churches to this day, but sadly, friends, in my experience, it happens all too often. Moses is understandably furious now and in this situation, and in verse 15 he implores the Lord. He doesn't call for their destruction, he simply implores the Lord not to accept his offerings, emphasizing that he has never taken anything from them, not even a donkey, and also that he has never caused any harm to them. So Moses is reminding the Lord that it is he who led them, and he led the people, God's people, as their appointed leader, with integrity, despite these baseless accusations that are being made against him. Picking up on verse 16, the text tells us this. Moses said to Korah, "You and your followers are to appear before the Lord tomorrow, you and they and Aaron. Each man is to take a censer and put incense in it, 250 censers in all, and present it before the Lord. You and Aaron are to present your censers also." So each of them took his censer, put burning coals and incense on it, and stood with Moses and Aaron at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Korah had gathered all the followers in opposition to them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. The Lord then said to Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourself from this assembly, so I can put an end to them at once." But Moses and Aaron fell face down and cried out, "O God, the God who gives breath to all living things, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins?" Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." And Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram and the elders of Israel who followed him, and he warned the assembly, "Move back from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away because of all their sins." So they moved away from the tent of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children, and the little ones at the entrance of the tents. Wow, you can see that this isn't going to end well, can't you? What we've seen here is Moses instructs each person to bring their own individual censer before the Lord. So there's 250 of these guys, all bringing their own individual offerings, everyone including Aaron and Korah. They do it. They put the incense in the censers, and they gather and stand at the door of the tabernacle. Meanwhile, Korah, the one who's rallied the entire community, he's the principal in this rebellion against Moses and Aaron, is there also. This is a very tense situation, isn't it? Imagine the intensity here. People are going to know what the Lord thinks of all this in a moment. There's 250 people standing, in a sense, against Moses and Aaron, who have been moved to one side. The atmosphere will have been thick with smoke as well as anger and uncertainty. Then in verse 20, we see the Lord speaking to Moses and Aaron, and he commands them to separate themselves from the congregation so that they would not be consumed when the moment of judgment comes. And Moses and Aaron, instead of simply just doing that, they immediately respond by pleading with the Lord, appealing to his wisdom and questioning whether it is in fact just, the fact that he is a just God, whether it is therefore just for the whole congregation to suffer for the sins of these few 250 people. So God then instructs Moses to tell the main congregation to move away from the tents of these three guys and their followers, warning them to distance their tents from the tents of these wicked men, as God describes, so that they can avoid sharing in the punishment. And the people comply, and they gather their families separately outside their tents nearby. The text then tells us what happens next. Then Moses said this is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, and that it was not my idea. If these men die a natural death and suffer the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt. So this is being said to the wider congregation, those people beyond the 250 and the leaders. Verse 31, as soon as he'd finished saying all this, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their household and those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead, with everything they owned, and the earth closed over them, and they perished, and they were gone from the community. At their cries, all the Israelites around them fled, shouting, the earth is going to swallow us too. And then a fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. Wow. So Moses positioned all this thing as a sort of a test, isn't he? He says, if these people who you see before you, the leaders and the followers of the rebellion, if they die naturally, it means clearly that I wasn't sent by the Lord. However, if the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up, this must signify that these men had indeed rejected the Lord and rejected those he had appointed in leadership over them. These verses are critical because it clarifies that Moses never exalted himself, but simply acted under the authority of the Lord that he had been given. And if the earth swallowed these people up, it will and should completely validate Moses' leadership and dismiss any possibility of future complaints against them. Anyway, Moses explains that their complaint, that these guys in rebellion and their followers, ultimately the real thing going on here is that they're complaining against the Lord's authority. And he presents the whole community with a straightforward test. If you see them die of natural causes, it would affirm their righteousness and the fact that what they're saying was true. But if the earth swallows them up, it would confirm Moses' authority as leader and God's outworking of his justice in this situation. And there's no delay, is it? It says, just as Moses finishes speaking, the ground splits open beneath them, and the earth consumes Korah and his household, and he and his immediate followers. Well, in verse 35, it says that they go into the earth, and then it concludes by telling us that fire comes down from the Lord, and even the 250 men who were offering incense on their censers were consumed by that fire also. So the Lord did not accept their offerings. Okay, final part of this chapter, verse 36 to the end. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, to remove the censers from the charred remains and scatter the coals some distance away, for the censers are holy. The censers of all the men who sinned at the cost of their lives, hammer the censers into sheets to overlay the altar. For they were presented before the Lord and have become holy. Let them be a sign to the Israelites. So Eleazar the priest, he collected the bronze censers brought by those who had been burned to death, and he had them hammered out and overlaid the altar with them. And the Lord directed him through Moses. This was done to remind the Israelites that no one except a descendant of Aaron should ever come to burn incense before the Lord, or he would become like Korah and his followers. The next day, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So they're back at it again, aren't they? Verse 41, you have killed the Lord's people, they said. But when the assembly gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron and turned towards the tent of meeting, suddenly the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron went up to the front of the tent of the meeting, and the Lord said to Moses, get away from the assembly so I can put an end to them at once. But they fell face down. Then Moses said to Aaron, Take your censer and put your incense in it, along with the burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord, and a plague has started." So Aaron did just as Moses said, and ran into the midst of the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague that day, in addition to those who died because of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and the plague had stopped. Wow. So is all this judgment of God fair? Are they based on clear moral standards? Well, for an answer to that, let's close today by turning to Exodus 20, where the Ten Commandments are given. And this passage demonstrates that God's judgments are never arbitrary. So what I want to read for you is Exodus 20, verse 4, which says this: "You shall not make yourself the carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or this is in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I am the Lord your God, and the jealous God, visiting the iniquity of fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation." So can you see it? Here in the middle of the Ten Commandments narrative found in Exodus 20, it mentions God's punishment and saying that sometimes it will extend to the third and fourth generations of those who have proven to hate him and have moved against him. Now, some question the fairness of this whole idea, but it's crucial to note the context. The verse specifies that the judgment will fall on those who personally follow the sins of their fathers. Of course, not all children will inherit or copy their parents' vices or sins, but this says that those who do and who perpetuate that sinful behavior are going to be held accountable. And it is that understanding that sheds lights on these terrible events we've witnessed in Numbers 16. In verse 33 of Numbers 16, we saw that Korah and his followers were swallowed alive by the earth, and that the Israelites reacted with fear, fearing a similar fate. But they were acting in the style and in the manner of the previous generations who had just recently rebelled themselves by not going in to the promised land. So following all the events that we've witnessed here, we see the Lord instruct Aaron's son, that's Eleazar, the priest, to repurpose the censers that has been used by these rebels. They are to be turned into hammered plates and used as a covering for the altar. So thereafter it serves as a visible reminder for future generations not to do that, not to go in that direction, not to inherit their parents' vices and sins. And this incident is immortalized in that way for those in that time, but for us today in the scriptures, memorialized to serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder to this day. Just as they had a visible reminder of the hammered censers into plates on that day, this is meant to serve as a text, as an aid memoir for us who still live today. But it's not just an Old Testament thing. There are other passages in Scripture, granted many in the Old Testament, where God's judgments are seen to serve as lessons for posterity, such as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it also happens in the New Testament with the like of the fate of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. All of these events are meant to underscore the seriousness of sin and the importance of obedience. The reaction of the people, sadly, in this closing passage, well, it's both perplexing, because they carry on doing this again and again, and it's disheartening, I suppose. Despite the unmistakable evidence of God's intervention on behalf of Moses and Aaron, we see that the people will still persist in their misguiding grumblings for years and years to come. But we need to understand that this phenomenon is not new and it is not unique to this ancient biblical account. It is meant to resonate with our contemporary Christian experience and give us insights when things go wrong in modern Christian communities, those things we call churches. On many instances, I sadly have seen individuals or factions within congregations harvest specific grievances and whip them up against the leadership, convinced of their own righteousness and divine endorsement of doing that. This self-righteous conviction will often lead to division and discord within the church community. Well, it's obvious it'll do that at least. Sometimes it will even lead to church splits and schisms. All the time, each party believes they're acting in accordance with God's will. The tragic fact remains that those stirring discord in those days and those who are doing it today still often have the conviction that they are acting in accordance with God's will. And they maintain that position even sometimes after God's unmistakable intervention or God's unmissable guidance in Scripture that this is not what they should be doing. Some still continue to pursue their own agendas. So this, friends, serves as a cautionary tale, not just for them then, but for believers everywhere to this day, reminding us of the dangers of this sort of self-righteousness and the importance of humility and discernment in our interactions, not only with God, with leaders, and with fellow believers alike. In the end, the toll of this rebellion will seem to be, even after all these events, another plague, with 14,700 people declared as perishing, and that's in addition on top of those who died in Korah's rebellion earlier that day. Again, the story is meant to underscore potential consequences of rebellion against God, but also against God's appointed leadership. It serves as a sobering reminder of the fact that the wages of sin is indeed death. Furthermore, it is illustrating for us that broad spiritual principle that rebellion against God, and it can take various forms. It can be taken openly as an attack on God himself, or subvertently at an attack on God's anointed people, that type of disingenuous attack on God, in whatever form it takes, in fact leads to spiritual death. All of this, friends, is meant to serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the potential consequences of disobedience and the need for humility and obedience in our service, always before God. Thanks for being with me here today. Now, that was a big passage today. Some of this stuff I've certainly read before, but I've not actually preached on many of the passages that I'm reading and working through today. So preparation time is taking a little longer. So I'm virtually preparing the night before and recording the next day at the moment. I'm certainly not the 5 to 7 days I like to be ahead. So if you notice very shortly in the future a day missing, well, more likely what I'll do, I'll just drop in, I think I'm going to call them rather than a podcast, a snapcast, while I'll drop in a 5 or 10 minute episode just to keep things ticking over until I can get ahead of myself. But anyway, we'll see how that works out. That may or may not happen. The main thing is that I'm enjoying this time studying this portion of the Word of God for the first time in depth. And I'm sure that's the story for some of you. So welcome along on this journey with me, and we'll crack through as best we can together. And I would remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast wherever it is you get your podcasts from. It's always free, always freely available, and there are free resources attached to it in the form of an episode notes page, as well as a complete, accurate transcript of pretty much everything I will say. Those are available. Well, they're put available in links in the episode notes, but some of the podcast providers now, particularly the big ones, they block any active links outside of their websites. That's okay. You're having their service for free. They're trying to keep you within their platform. But if you're not seeing access to those additional resources, then why not visit me on the Bible Project Daily podcast at buzzsprout.com, where it's host. There you'll find links to things like my other history podcast, one that comes out once every 2 to 3 weeks and is telling the history of the Christian church from a biblical Christian perspective, along with links to things like my Patreon community, where you can choose to support this ministry from $2 a month, because it is that and those people that enable me to make this my full-time occupation. Without those people, I'm not able to do this, and I'm not able to make this free all over the world on all these podcast platforms. So if you want to be part of this, you can do that over there. But you'll also find links to all the socials, YouTube, LinkedIn page, and all those other things. And by the way, on Patreon, I put loads and loads of bonus material. There's over 50 hours of extra free bonus material, recordings of talks or my preparation for talks that I give in secular environments. So not on the normal subjects that you would think. That's why they don't really fit in with the Bible Project podcast. But it gives an insight of my attempts, for what they're worth, to try and take the truth of the Bible and the message of the gospel onto enemy territory, so to speak, to go into places like philosophy societies, psychology, study groups, art societies, all sorts of wild and wonderful places, and try and find an intersection point where I can present the love of God and the life-changing message of the Bible. So I'd love it for any of you to come and support me in that vision, and you can do that over on Patreon. But having said all that, the main thing is, always the main thing is, I'm grateful that you're here and that you're listening, and that together we're working through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. So don't forget to come back very soon as we meet together again on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.